Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are doing another hot takes episode here with Free Speech Forward. And Chris and I are pretty excited because this really is going to be a hot takes series of a sorts because we realize there is a fundamental issue in our culture that we think we really absolutely need to address as advocates and champions for free speech, as people who want to see this value and this idea have more influence in the culture. There are some alarming trends in the opposite direction that I think we absolutely need to talk about. And this has come out of the wake of what is now the third assassination attempt on Trump, our current sitting president, and just recognizing what this might show about attitudes towards political violence in our culture that are so diametrically opposed to everything that free speech is all about. So, Chris, why don't I turn it over to you and we'll get started opening up this discussion that will lead into this whole little mini series.
Sure. Yeah. And just briefly to set the tables, as of now, we're thinking at least 3 episodes. It might expand to more, but in part 1, we just want to talk about this phenomenon of what we're calling the rise of a culture of political violence and the corresponding decline of a culture of free speech, because we think they very much go together. And then in part 2, we're going to talk through what we see as some of the causes behind this and try and parse through what's driving this trend in both directions. And then in part 3, at least, we're going to talk about the question that is on a lot of people's minds and that keeps coming up when these types of political assassination or violence acts happen, about who bears responsibility for it, and how to think about the question of responsibility, rhetoric, and agency for free speech in a culture that still values and protects free speech, and how to do it. So with that, as Joia said, today, we wanted to just firstly start with this question of what is happening. Why does it seem like this is becoming more frequent, and even more ominously, that we're almost becoming desensitized and expecting it? So looking at that event that just happened, I think it was 2 weekends ago now, that the White House Correspondents' Dinner, an annual gala for the journalists who cover the White House. This was actually President Trump's first time ever attending across both of his terms. He famously boycotted it throughout his first term, and then even boycotted last year, the first year of his second term, but he decided to go this year. And then lo and behold, there was an attack on the event that canceled it right when it had just gotten started. So luckily, thankfully, there was enough security there that they disarmed and debilitated the assailant before he could harm anyone else. Well, he did harm, I think, one Secret Service agent, but that agent is doing well. But this was now, as Joy said, the third attempt, at least, that we know of, and we know there's been several others, and probably many others that we don't know of, on President Trump's life. I think we can get into questions of, is this a unique phenomenon to Trump? Is this just reflective of a growing culture of violence? But there have been other events in the last year, most, tragically, the successful assassination of Charlie Kirk, which in many ways prompted this series of hot takes for us to do. And so this is just, and even that came on the heels of the shocking 2 attempts against Trump during the 2024 campaign that we learned about in Butler, Pennsylvania, and then in down near Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. So we've seen this, and then there were attacks on, even state and local representatives last year in Minnesota and elsewhere, and this has been going on and growing. At least
also, let's not forget private individuals like the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, who was not a political figure, but presumably, from what we know, was assassinated out of motivations that came out of a kind of political disagreement with his position on healthcare. And unfortunately, healthcare has become politicized in our era in ways that you and I would agree it should not be. That being
Right.
said, just more this rise of violence against people with whom you disagree to the worst events.
To the worst events. Yeah. No, that's a great point. So that's the precipitating kind of event and context of this series. And so I guess the question is this really a growing phenomenon, or are we just kind of noticing things more because of our always on 24/7 media and social media culture and access to instantaneous information? And I think we love to use this series of hot takes to actually survey real world data and even reference other people's work and commentary on these types of events. So we want to kind of refer to some of that data to, I think it does paint a very clear picture that number one, this is indeed a rising trend of Americans accepting political violence as warranted or justified in certain instances. We're seeing that growing across the board, but then also that it is a particularly acute problem on the political left, and then we can even maybe get into a little bit of that, or we will get into a little bit of why that might be, throughout the rest of this series. But I don't know, Joy, if you wanted to.
Issues on the political right that I think we will address too.
Well, yeah, I preface this by saying it's growing across the board, but it's more acute on the left. And I think and I think we have to make that distinction, because I think, you have to, as they always say,
Well,
if
I
you
think
don't.
there's reasons why we see kinds of violence on the left and it's different on the right. But yeah, things that we'll definitely talk about in the series.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, it's incumbent upon us to properly identify the nature of the problem if we want
Yes.
to obviously combat it and defeat it.
Yes.
So I don't know, Joya, do you want to maybe start off with any of the commentary or polling or other data you've seen on this, and just reflect on this question of the growing rise of political violence in our culture?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll point out that I think we'll definitely share a bunch of links in the show notes. So, people could definitely feel free to check the show notes and follow through definitely for this episode. This will be the episode where I think we're going to put a whole bunch of the links to the research. So, this is one where you definitely want to go back to the show notes. I wouldn't even pick up on something that you said about what we're even noticing. And you had mentioned perhaps something about social media. Is this somehow a causal factor? And I want to point out that even in this series, Chris and I are not going to purport to have all of the answers. We're really here to try to, I think, ask the questions and put the issues on the table and try to think through what are some of the factors and trying to assess what causal relevance they might have. And so I want to put out, even before we get to some of this research, to say that I do think there is something about the era that we're living in, the social media era, not only of 24/7 news, but also of hyperbolic, polarizing content. We live in an era where the news that we see has been through the way the algorithms are designed, which are perhaps even the way that humans are designed. The old adage from the news about if it bleeds, it leads, that we are shown perhaps the most striking, the most egregious, the most hyperbolic, the most histrionic examples of rhetoric are what we are exposed to. And so many people are exposed to so much. This is what people are producing. This is what gets the likes. This is what gets the attention. And I think it's going to be a question that we're going to have of how much is this having a factor. But what the research, what we're going to show some through the links, but some of the polls definitely show, is that there definitely has been an increase in seeing this kind of violence towards speech or acceptance of political violence. There is a rise of this amongst the younger generation, amongst Gen Z, amongst those who did grow up in the TikTok social media era. And again, we might think about, does this have to do with perhaps some of the ways in which they have been educated, trends that we've seen in education, perhaps, that has the education that itself has maybe become more politicized, more polarizing, more insistent to paint political opponents as evil and not just perhaps incorrect and worthy of disagreement. But certainly this is one that I know I wanted to share that came out of FIRE's research. They've obviously been doing this kind of research. FIRE which started out as an organization specific to campuses, although they've now expanded their purview. But as an organization that started out focused on the issue of free speech on campuses, has been doing research and polling on this for decades, I'm sure, and has posted about this alarming trend where we see that throughout the generations, it is as the generations get younger. So I guess it's the boomers who find the violence least acceptable, and as you kind of go up, that Gen Z unfortunately shows the most acceptance of violence against speech, which is scary thinking about the future of our country.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's right. So Joia, as she mentioned, we're going to include a lot of these references. So, but I want to kind of talk through them, even in the discussion. So she mentions this fire study. I think there's some other good research that's come out recently that can also kind of answer this question of is this actually a growing phenomenon, or just is this a kind of awareness bias, confirmation bias effect, if you will, of our access to information. And it definitely is, I have not seen a ton of like long-term trend data on this question. I'm sure it is out there, and we'll look to see if we can. But a lot of what's been circulating, especially in the wake of the latest Trump assassination attempt 2 weeks ago, it is more recent within the last couple of years data, but it surveys people across generational cohorts and demographics. And so I think you can kind of infer just by seeing the rising curve of acceptability across different generations. And it is, it's inversely correlated with age. So as you get older, there's less acceptability of political violence as a legitimate tool. And you see that kind of data consistently repeated across multiple studies. Joia referenced this fire study, which we'll share. There was a YouGov Economist study done in September of last year that asked, is it ever justified for citizens to resort to violence in order to achieve political goals? And it found that kind of across the board, if you were 60 and up, so you could the baby boomer generation effectively, the kind of average acceptability there was less than 10% across all kind of political persuasions and identifications. And then it kind of, you contrast that with the youth generation, really Gen Z plus Gen Y, millennials, get age 18 to 39. There you see, in most cases, doubling or tripling of the rate of acceptability. And it's a linear curve for the generations in the middle. So it is, and we see that again repeated across, for instance, there's the Skeptic Research Center. This is a nonpartisan coalition of analysts that kind of formed in the online age, that they publish a lot of their work on X. So we'll be sharing a lot of their X tweets. But they've done some extensive work on this as well, parsing across different age demographics and ideological persuasions or partisan affiliations. And they are seeing the same thing, that the younger the generation, the higher the proportion of acceptability. Shockingly, in one of their recent studies that they released, they show that among Gen Z, to kind of put a finer point or a more precise point on Joya's point here, that among Gen Z, you see, and they even parsed it across racial demographics as well. You see, the average across the entire gen of all demographics for Gen Z is over 40%. Think that violence is often necessary to create social change, was the question. And among certain demographics, in particular, Black Gen Zers, they registered, at least by their poll, 53% agreement with that statement. And just by comparison, the same demographic of Black baby boomers was only 9%. So there you see essentially a quintupling of support for political violence between the oldest and the youngest generation.
So, any thoughts about this? Introductory thoughts, because we're obviously going to go into more detail with this mini series. But what else do you want to say?
Well, I think I think the point we want to make here is that yes, this is a growing problem. And so maybe let's return back to free speech, right? And how this relates to the decline in free speech. I think, this will bleed a little bit into the next week's or the next discussion, next hot takes discussion, part 2 of the series on causes. But definitely, I would say it's not a coincidence that we see this growing support for political violence at the same time that we're registering all these things, all these new trends and buzzwords and phrases and ideas of things like speech is violence, and violence, kind of my violence is my speech, essentially to protect or defend against. I think this noxious idea um, that has blurred the lines of distinction between speech and physical force. I think that is a huge source of both the confusion as well as perhaps the intentional or unintentional, kind of energy behind seeing physical force, political violence as acceptable because of this idea that, oh, well, if this person's speech is supposedly, not just harmful mentally or intellectually, psychologically, emotionally to me, but is somehow if those things are deemed as somehow causing physical harm to you, then it's not much of a logical leap within its own context to say, well, then I have a right to hit back, strike back at people who are harming me, quote unquote, with that. So and to me, that is perhaps the dominant idea among younger generations, is that speech is violence, and therefore my violent response to your offensive speech is somehow justified, is my form of speech back to you. When you blur the distinction between speech and physical force, then it's not going to be a surprise that people start to see them as somewhat indistinguishable. So I just think that probably explains, and we can get into why and where that thought comes from in our discussion on potential causes or factors. But I just think that probably explains a lot of it. And of course, that is a core source of the problem of our quote unquote decline in the culture of free speech here. And it's certainly something that Joia and I have been experiencing and witnessing and trying to fight against for as long as we've been in this battle, going back to our college days, which is what initially kind of brought us together.
Exactly. Well, I think this is a pretty good setup, so I'm looking forward to the mini series here. I definitely see that this could go on for more than 3 parts, because even as we're talking, I'm already getting some new ideas of things we probably have to talk about. So, but it's definitely, I think, worthwhile talking about, because this is perhaps the core issue that of our current time that we have to solve if we want
Yeah.
the future, that we have to figure out how to reinstate some of these basic values and basic understanding about free speech in order to stop the violence that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I will just add one maybe other point on this one, especially since we started with the Trump assassination attempt. I think there might be there's probably others who might look at this. I think the trend data that we've already referenced, as well as the other surveys and information we're going to link to, I think makes very clear that this is a kind of generalized phenomenon. It's not particular to any one ideology, partisan camp, or individual, but I do think there is a particular kind of assassination chic culture around certain disfavored figures, of which President Trump is probably the most prominent, of course. Number one, he's the most powerful person in the world and in our current culture. Number two, he's obviously has dominated the cultural discourse in the past decade more than probably any of us have in our lifetimes have ever experienced. So just that exposure and that constant exposure has made him a unique target. And then, of course, he's arguably one of the most polarizing figures in our times and culture. So I think there's definitely a culture that also demonizes and dehumanizes individuals, particularly prominent individuals. You see this with people like Elon Musk, or frankly, sadly, anyone associated with Trump. But you also see it with other kind of disfavored figures, across the spectrum in some instances. And I just think that it's part and parcel of this decline in the culture of not only free speech, but the culture of individual rights that kind of goes alongside with it. But I just think it's also incumbent upon us to not go down that road of kind of rationalizing or justifying political violence against, or carving out exceptions and saying, oh, well, we're against political violence except for these certain individuals because they somehow or some way are, uniquely evil or kind of stand outside of the bounds of rights protections and peaceful, rational society.
Can I just add one little point here? This will be my one little rant, and then we'll end. There's the common refrain you hear that like, oh, if Hitler were alive, he would go after Hitler. After World War II, we had the Nuremberg Trials to go after the Nazis. Like this was like the way we literally responded to Nazis in the era, after World War II was not this vision, this dream of violence that so many people seem to have. So that's what's going to be my final thought here as we just gear up for the rest of the series.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great point. And it's interesting that you see more and more of that type of cultural, even in our kind of mass media and, Hollywood and other film, TV depictions, like that seems to be the response is like, let's go back, rewind history and try and kill Hitler, ahead of time, as if we could have ever had that clairvoyance about how people will behave in advance in the first place. But interestingly, that even there, people's imagination seems somewhat limited or narrowly prescribed in the, oh, well, let's respond through violent acts of our own versus what we actually did, as you said, which was we responded using rule of law, legitimate, kind of
A
objective
more
law.
truly liberal, humane,
Correct.
not violent procedure.
Exactly. So great point. Yeah, we'll end on that, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in the next one. See you all next time.
See you then.